The Great Barrier Reef, huh? It's like a diver's paradise, right? All those vibrant corals, amazing marine life. But it's also, kind of wild out there. And that wildness, sometimes it can turn, well, dangerous. And when that happens, it can leave behind these mysteries that just make you wonder what really went down out there.
It's true, the allure of the reef is undeniable, but it comes with a certain level of risk that's important to respect.
Right, exactly. And that's what we're diving into today, the disappearance of Tom and Eileen Lonergan. It was back in 1998. And get this, we've got court transcripts, personal diaries, even expert opinions, and guess what? They don't all add up. It's a real-life puzzle, folks. You're probably thinking, how could this even happen on a dive trip?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. Okay, so picture this. It's January 1998, beautiful tropical Queensland, Australia. Tom and Eileen Lonergan, a young American couple, show up ready for adventure. They'd even spent time in the Peace Corps, teaching and diving in Tuvalu. I mean, these weren't just your average tourists.
No, not at all. They were quite experienced divers, very comfortable in the ocean. Actually, they had over 80 dives under their belts at that point.
Oh, 80 dives. That's a lot. But you mentioned experience. Even with that many dives, were there still specific challenges they might have faced diving the Great Barrier Reef?
Oh, absolutely. The Great Barrier Reef, it's massive. And the conditions, well, they can change in an instant. You've got currents that shift quickly, visibility that can go from clear to murky just like that. And navigating the underwater terrain, that requires expertise, even for experienced divers.
Complacency can be dangerous, even deadly, as we'll see. So walk us through their trip. They started in Cairns and then headed to Port Douglas for the dive boat, right?
Yeah, that's right. They booked a trip with Outer Edge Dive Company. It was on January 25th. They boarded the MV Outer Edge. And here's something to keep in mind. The dive industry back then, in the late 90s, it wasn't as strictly regulated as it is today. Some might even say it was a bit more relaxed.
Relaxed, huh? Okay, so they set off on their dive. Were there any red flags, anything that stood out at that point?
Well, there were some delays that day. Things that could have added a bit of pressure to the crew's schedule.
Yeah.
But finally, they reached the dive site, St. Christian Reef. Tom and Eileen decided to dive as a buddy team, which, given their experience, they were allowed to do.
So experienced divers, diving as a buddy team, seems pretty standard. But wasn't buddy diving still considered kind of risky, even back then? I mean, you're relying on one other person in this massive, unpredictable environment.
You're right to point that out. Buddy diving definitely has its inherent risks. Communication, mutual awareness, those are absolutely critical. Because if one diver gets separated, or if there's a problem, well, their buddy is their lifeline. It's a system that relies on both divers being incredibly vigilant and responsive.
And that's where things get really strange, right? Because no one even notices Tom and Eileen are missing for, get this, 2 whole days. How's that even possible?
It's a detail that's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? It wasn't until Tuesday, January 27th, that the crew found a dive bag and a plastic bag with their belongings on the boat.
Wait, so they did a head count and somehow missed 2 people? I mean, wouldn't their absence be, super obvious?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But the inquest later revealed some pretty concerning details about their procedures. It seems there was confusion about who was actually responsible for the final head count, and their records. Well, let's just say they weren't exactly meticulously kept.
So maybe they were more focused on keeping to their schedule than making sure everyone was accounted for. That's incredibly unsettling. So at this point, they realize 2 people are missing. What happens next?
Well, a massive search operation gets underway. They had planes, helicopters, boats, volunteers, all combing the area. But remember, the Great Barrier Reef is enormous.
Yeah, and those currents can be incredibly strong, right? I mean, even if they surfaced somewhere other than the dive site, they could have been swept miles away.
Precisely. And sadly, the search only turned up a few pieces of their gear. They found a life vest with Tom's name on it, and then a fin with Eileen's name miles apart.
Talk about searching for a needle in a haystack. So no sign of Tom and Eileen, just those scattered pieces of gear. What were investigators thinking at that point?
Well, as you can imagine, with so few answers, speculation ran wild. Some people started wondering, could they have staged their own disappearance?
I've heard that theory. What evidence were people pointing to for that?
They focused on the fact that Tom and Eileen were wearing full wetsuits for the dive, speculating that maybe they were. For a long swim. Others mentioned their belongings being neatly packed on the boat, saying it seemed odd if they just vanished during the dive.
But couldn't those details just be explained by their experience level and preparation? I mean, full wetsuits are pretty standard, especially for experienced divers. And who doesn't pack their bag neatly?
You make a good point. It's crucial to separate speculation from actual evidence. Those details, while potentially suggestive, don't definitively point to a staged disappearance.
So, what other theories were floating around?
Well, there was a much darker theory that started circulating. The possibility of a murder-suicide.
Oh, wow. Okay, so now things are getting really complicated. And this is where those diaries come into play, right? But before we delve into those, maybe you could explain what an inquest is for those of us who might not be familiar with the term.
Sure. An inquest is basically a legal inquiry conducted by a coroner, you see. It's to determine the cause of death, especially in cases where the circumstances are unclear, like a way to gather evidence and establish facts surrounding a death.
So the inquest was already in motion, and then they stumbled upon these diaries.
Exactly. The diaries, well, they added a whole new layer of complexity to the investigation. And as you can imagine, personal diaries, they're full of raw emotions, private thoughts. It's tough to interpret them objectively.
Yeah, I can only imagine what it was like for their families having those private thoughts suddenly, out there for everyone to see. Did investigators at least handle the diaries with some sensitivity, considering the circumstances?
Well, the diaries became a focal point of the inquest. And unfortunately, they also ended up playing a key role in the trial against Outer Edge.
So let's talk about what was actually in these diaries. Were they really as dark and troubling as some people have made them out to be?
The defense attorney in the case against Outer Edge, he definitely tried to paint that picture. He focused on certain entries, often just little snippets, that seemed to suggest Tom and Eileen were deeply troubled.
Like what? What kinds of things were they writing?
Well, for example, the defense highlighted an entry where Tom was really critical of himself, using words like obnoxious, overbearing, even offensive. And in one of Eileen's entries, she expressed frustration with her job, writing that she hated teaching and was terrified of death.
Those are pretty strong words, but couldn't you argue that everyone has moments of, like, self-doubt or frustration? Do those entries really mean they were suicidal?
That's the point that psychologists who looked at the diaries emphasized. They cautioned against reading too much into isolated entries, arguing that Tom's self-criticism, while harsh, could also be interpreted as, well, a sign of self-awareness, a desire to grow.
That makes sense. I mean, it's healthy to acknowledge your flaws, right? Doesn't mean you're about to have a breakdown or anything.
Right. And as for Eileen's fear of death, well, that's a pretty common human emotion, wouldn't you say? Especially for someone who spent so much time in and around the ocean.
Yeah, I think most of us have a healthy fear of death. And being out there, surrounded by the vastness and power of the ocean, it could definitely amplify that feeling.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that the investigators ultimately concluded that neither diary actually contained anything that directly suggested they intended to end their lives.
Okay, so despite the defense attorney's attempts to create this narrative of a troubled couple, the diaries themselves don't really support that theory. So, what was the official conclusion of the inquest?
The inquest determined that Tom and Eileen died as a result of being left behind by the Outer Edge dive boat. The coroner was incredibly critical of the company's safety procedures, even calling them slipshod and devil-may-care.
Wow, those are some pretty strong words. What specifically did the coroner take issue with?
Well, the inquest uncovered a number of concerning issues. For instance, there was confusion over who was actually in charge of the final head count. Dive logs were incomplete, and there was just this general lack of attention to detail when it came to safety protocols.
It sounds like, I don't know, a recipe for a disaster. Even if it wasn't intentional, that level of negligence is shocking, especially when you're dealing with people's lives.
Absolutely. And the coroner's findings really highlighted a bigger problem within the dive industry at that time, a lack of consistent and enforceable safety regulations.
So this case, it wasn't just about the tragic loss of 2 lives. It also exposed these systemic problems within the industry itself. What happened after the inquest? Was anyone held accountable?
The co-owner and skipper of the Outer Edge, Jack Nan, he was charged with manslaughter by criminal negligence.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't legal experts, can you break down what that charge actually means?
Sure, it basically means that the prosecution believed Jack Nan's actions, or in this case inaction, directly contributed to the deaths of Tom and Eileen. They argued that he failed in his duty of care to his passengers.
So the case goes to trial. What was the atmosphere like in the courtroom?
Intense, to say the least. You had conflicting testimonies, Lots of legal back and forth, and of course those diaries were front and center. The prosecution focused on the company's negligence, while the defense kept pushing that narrative of a possible suicide pact or a staged disappearance, relying heavily on those carefully selected diary entries.
It must have been incredibly difficult for Tom and Eileen's families to have to sit there and listen to their loved ones' private words being, dissected and used to support a theory that painted them in such a negative light.
You can only imagine the pain and frustration they must have felt. It felt like the focus was shifting away from the company's responsibility and onto Tom and Eileen's character, which in their eyes was a complete misrepresentation of who they truly were.
And what about Jack Nan? What was his defense?
He maintained his innocence throughout the trial, saying that he truly believed Tom and Eileen were safely back on board after the dive. He argued that the crew had followed standard procedures and that he was devastated by the couple's disappearance. He even said he'd searched for them for hours, convinced they had to have surfaced somewhere nearby.
It's hard to know what to believe at this point. You've got these conflicting accounts, emotional testimonies, and then the diaries just add this whole other layer of uncertainty. So, what was the verdict?
After deliberating for less than 90 minutes, the jury found Jack Nan not guilty on all charges.
Wow, that's surprising. I mean, given the coroner's findings and all the evidence about the company's negligence, I would have thought a guilty verdict was almost certain.
It was a controversial verdict, no doubt, and it really shook the community. The Lonigan's families were heartbroken, feeling that justice hadn't been served and that the defense's portrayal of Tom and Eileen had unfairly tarnished their memory.
It must have felt like a double loss for them, not only losing Tom and Eileen, but also feeling like their reputations had been damaged in the process.
Exactly. And while Jack Nan may have been legally exonerated, the case had a devastating impact on his life too. He lost his business, his home, his savings. Everything he had built was gone.
So even though he was found not guilty, he still paid a heavy price. It's just a tragic situation all around. No winners, just a lot of heartbreak and unanswered questions. It really makes you think about the human cost of these kinds of tragedies. Even when the legal system, does its thing and reaches a verdict, there's still this lingering sense of loss. So many unanswered questions.
It's true. And in this case, those unanswered questions, they're especially haunting. I mean, what really happened to Tom and Eileen out there beneath the waves? Were they disoriented? Did they get caught in a strong current? Did they make a mistake, a fatal one? Or was there something more, something we'll just never fully understand?
It's like we're piecing together this puzzle, but there are all these missing pieces. We've got those scattered bits of evidence, the diaries, the gear found miles apart, the conflicting stories from the crew. But the full picture, it's still a mystery.
And that's what makes this case so fascinating
Yeah.
and so frustrating. It really forces us to grapple with the limits of our knowledge, how ambiguous evidence can be, and that enduring power of mystery.
We talked about it earlier, but this case also had a huge impact on the dive industry, right? I mean, on a larger scale.
Oh, absolutely. This tragedy, it basically sparked a complete overhaul of safety regulations in the Australian dive industry. They implemented all these new guidelines, emphasizing stricter head counts, better record keeping, just increased awareness overall for divers.
So, in a way, Tom and Eileen's deaths, they weren't entirely in vain. Their story, as tragic as it is, it actually led to some meaningful changes that hopefully prevented similar incidents from happening.
That's one way to look at it. And it's true, the industry definitely took steps to improve safety standards. But it's important to remember that diving, it's inherently risky, right? Even with stricter regulations, human error happens. And unpredictable circumstances, those can still lead to accidents.
It's a good reminder that no matter how many rules and regulations you put in place, you can't eliminate risk entirely. But it sounds like the industry did learn some valuable lessons from this case. Have those changes been effective, in preventing similar tragedies?
It's hard to say for sure. There have been other cases, sadly, of divers being left behind, some with equally tragic outcomes. It seems that despite all the improvements in safety procedures, human error is still a factor.
And that's maybe the most unsettling part of this whole story. The realization that even in a seemingly controlled environment, like a guided dive, the potential for human error, for miscommunication, or even just a simple oversight, it can have devastating consequences.
Yeah, it really challenges our assumptions about safety, about control. It reminds us that even with experience, with careful planning, there are always these variables, these things we just can't anticipate or fully control.
So, where does that leave us? I mean, we've gone through the evidence, the theories, we've talked about the impact on the dive industry, but ultimately the question of what really happened to Tom and Eileen, It remains unanswered.
And maybe, in a way, that's the most fitting end to this story. It stays with us as this mystery, this reminder of how vast and powerful the ocean is, and how fragile human life really is.
You mentioned the diaries earlier and how these intensely personal documents became such a big part of the investigation. It makes me wonder if even those private thoughts, those fears and feelings, can be interpreted in so many different ways. Can we ever really truly know someone's intentions, their deepest fears, their motivations?
That's a deep question, and it's one that goes way beyond this particular case. It gets at the heart of human nature, the limits of our understanding, and the challenges of trying to reconstruct events when all we have are these incomplete pieces of information.
And in a world where information is everywhere, where stories are constantly being shaped and reshaped, it's more important than ever to approach these kinds of mysteries with a critical eye, to question our assumptions, to be open to different perspectives.
Exactly. This case, it's a powerful reminder that truth can be elusive, memories can be faulty, and even the most compelling narratives, they should be examined, questioned.
So, what do you think happened to Tom and Eileen? Were they failed by a negligent crew? Or did something darker happen out there under the waves?
I honestly don't have a definitive answer, and I doubt anyone ever will. But maybe the real lesson here, the takeaway from this deep dive, isn't about finding a neat and tidy solution. It's about recognizing the complexities of human nature, that fragility of life, and just how powerful a good mystery can be.
It's a case that sticks with you, and for anyone who wants to dig deeper, we'll include links to more information in the show notes. You can find excerpts from Tom and Eileen's diaries, articles about what happened after the case, all that good stuff.
It's a story that makes you think about the depths of the ocean, the depths of the human heart, and just the depths of the unknown. And sometimes the most important lessons come not from the answers, but from the questions that stay with us.
Well said. The Great Barrier Reef, it's a place of incredible wonder and beauty, but as we've seen, it's also a place that demands our respect, our humility, and sometimes the most captivating mysteries are the ones that remain unsolved.